My name is Michael Rosenthal, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and also a member of the Jewish Studies program. And I'd like to welcome you to the third and final lecture in the 33rd annual Samuel and Althea Stroum Lecture in Jewish Studies. On Tuesday evening, in his introduction, Joel Migdal told us what it was like to have Michael Walzer as his teacher at Harvard. And I, unfortunately, wasn't as fortunate as Joel. But Michael Walzer still managed to affect and influence my own intellectual development through primarily his written work, until I met him this week, through his written work. So it's kind of like, even if one can't be present at Sinai, we can still read the Bible and experience the event as if we'd been there. Or to take a more mundane example, I was thinking it's kind of, well, there's Star Trek, and then there's Star Trek The Next Generation. And so I was thinking of subtitling my introduction, Michael Walzer, or The Next Generation, that kind of thing. I've admired the work of Professor Walzer since my freshman year in college, when I was assigned to read Just and Unjust Wars in one of my classes. Spheres of Justice, he published in 1983 during my undergraduate years, and I think it would be fair to say that that work placed Michael Walzer among the central thinkers then and now of American political liberalism, alongside the work of John Rawls and Robert Nozick. His essay on Camus and the French-Algerian War, which first appeared in Dissent, also around that time, and then was reworked as a chapter in the Company of Critics, Social Criticism and Political Commitment in the 20th Century, in fact inspired me to write my undergraduate thesis on that topic. His well-known essay on the problem of dirty hands has deeply shaped my thinking on politics, and his work on the morality of military intervention in the affairs of other states, unfortunately, is still all too relevant. His work is unusual among much of what passes for academic philosophy and political thought these days for its obvious and passionate engagement in politics, actual politics, from the struggles over Vietnam to the current debates over Iraq. And in the preface of Just and Unjust Wars, Walzer writes that he was trying, in part, to, among many things, to articulate a moral vocabulary to describe the dilemmas that people faced, whether to support the war, how to be opposed to it, etc. And although he aims to formulate some general principles, he recognizes that we need to attend to concrete historical examples and to the cultural traditions in which people make sense of their actual political world. I think that this kind of dual aspect, the philosophical dimension and the attention to historical detail, helps make sense of the enduring philosophical value of Walzer's work and also its immediacy, right, when you read it. So we're privileged to have Michael Walzer as our Stroum Lecturer this year. The title of his talk this evening is Biblical Politics, Where Were the Elders? Please join me in welcoming Michael Walzer. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I've talked about the kings and about the prophets, and today my subject is the elders, and I'm very glad that there are so many of us here. It isn't easy reading the biblical texts to figure out how authority was actually exercised in ancient Israel, how politics worked or was thought to work at local as well as national levels. Who did what to whom? The prophets provide a rhetorically powerful answer to that question, which is also, I'm sure, a true answer. Powerful men grind the faces of the poor. But that's what powerful men, or some powerful men, always do or try to do. We want to know more than that. Who were the powerful men? How did they get that way? How successfully did they use their power? Were the poor ever able to resist? And who, besides the prophets, spoke for them? These questions can't be answered for Israel in the way that they can be answered for ancient Greece or Rome or medieval Europe or the modern state. Legal and administrative records have not survived, and the literature that has survived, while it contains many narratives of political action, is rarely focused on or reflective about the big political questions. The truth is that politics is not recognized by any of the biblical writers as a centrally important, let alone a humanly fulfilling activity. And for this reason, many of the political actors in the biblical histories remain shadowy figures. We know very little, for example, about the status and work of those royal officials who are variously referred to as princes, rulers, chiefs, governors, and masters of the palace, and not much more about the king's judges and scribes. But the most interesting shadows are the elders. Elders of different sorts are mentioned some 140 times in the Bible, and in only a small number of these cases is the reference non-political, just to old men or women generally. Mostly the elders are a group with a role to play, whose presence is required for some purpose. They are elders of Israel, of Judah, of Jerusalem, elders of the people, the land, the city, the priests. And that's a phrase that suggests a representative office and a sphere of responsibility. Elders were present at some of the most crucial events in the history of Israel. They played a leading part in the Sinai covenanting and some less defined part in the great covenant renewals described in the books of Joshua and 2 Kings, though they are not mentioned in Nehemiah. They seem to have ruled Israel, if anyone did, after Joshua's death, at least locally and for everyday purposes. They formed the delegation that came to Samuel to demand a king. They covenanted with David and anointed him king over Israel. They joined the procession that carried the ark to Solomon's temple. But who exactly were they? And what did they do? What were they supposed to do in between their textual appearances? In fact, we hardly know what they did when they appear. We are told of their presence, only rarely of their actions or opinions. Insofar as they speak in front of Samuel, for example, or at the trial of Jeremiah that I described last time, it's with one voice. We never hear elders arguing with one another, and no individual elder speaks in his own voice. The very first appearance of elders in the Bible, in this case the elders of Israel, is a paradigmatic example of how they are treated by the biblical writers. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses is commanded by God to gather the elders of Israel, tell them of the coming deliverance, and go with them to confront Pharaoh. And so the elders are duly gathered in accordance with God's instructions. But when Moses gets to the palace, they seem to have disappeared. The text reads, "And afterward Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh," etc. A rabbinic commentator asks, where were the elders? And goes on to suggest that they had gone along with Moses and Aaron at first, but then stealthily slipped away, one by one. Slaves still, they were afraid to confront their master. This is a nice and possibly an insightful story about the psychological consequences of slavery. It's equally possible, however, that the narrator simply takes the presence of the elders for granted. They're not mentioned because they have nothing to do or say. They are silent witnesses standing in for the people as a whole. This seems to be a part they frequently played, most clearly at the covenantal renewals, though some part of the people were also present on those occasions. But they could not have played this part unless they also had some more substantive responsibilities. I'm not going to try to say what those responsibilities really were. That's a task for historians of ancient Israel. I only want to know what the biblical writers tell us and what they don't tell us about these officials, if that's what they were. I shall respect the reticence of the biblical writers, but not so much as to deny myself the chance to question it and try to explain it. Assume for now that the elders were significant actors in Israel's politics. Otherwise, they would not appear so frequently in the texts. Why then are we told so little about them? Who were the elders? Where were they? Their name applies that they were the leaders of kin groups, patriarchs. The Hebrew noun is always masculine in political contexts. They were men who regularly acted together. The noun is always plural. Individual elders may have exercised authority over their own families or clans. In all the settings noticed by the biblical writers, the elders form a group. They come and go together. They are consulted together when they are consulted. They are witnesses together. They speak, as I've already said, with a single voice. Only rarely, however, do we get a glimpse of an assembly of elders, and these cases have mostly to do with war. When the elders, in Chronicles, they're called chiefs of the fathers or heads of the children. They are presented as leading the tribal muster and counseling the king about military matters. It's possible that in pre-monarchic Israel, the tribal confederation was represented by some sort of occasional assembly. Thus, an obscure and very much disputed passage in the blessing of Moses in Deuteronomy 33, "Then God became king in Jeshurun when the heads of the people assembled the tribes of Israel together." But in none of the biblical texts is there anything like an institutionalized assembly meeting regularly with members chosen in such and such a way. No doubt there were meetings of elders, but not of such a kind or not dealing with subjects of such a kind as to attract the interests of our authors. The standard biblical reference is not to the assembly or congregation or council of elders. The preposition always comes after the noun, elders of. The elders are always part of some larger whole, though what their relation is to the whole and to its other parts is radically unclear. Attempts to place the elders within a larger constitutional structure invariably misrepresent the openness of that reiterated preposition, elders of. Consider, for example, the elders of the city, who are most frequently mentioned in Deuteronomy. And there they are assigned certain judicial responsibilities having to do with both criminal and civil law, in the case I'm going to come to, marriage law. They act alongside judges and priests, but with their own specific tasks, and not, except in our construction, as members of a legal or administrative hierarchy. Nothing is said about how the elders of the city are chosen from among all the elders in the city. The book of Ruth provides the only account of elders actually performing one of the tasks assigned in Deuteronomy, acting as witnesses in a refusal or an acceptance of levirate obligations, the obligation of the surviving brother to marry the widow of the dead brother. The witnesses are chosen, seemingly at random, by Boaz, the second surviving brother who intends to meet the obligations. And the text reads this way, "And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, 'Sit ye down here,' and they sat down." Any group of 10 will do, presumably. No regular session of city elders is described in the text. It must have been a more determinate group of elders of Gilead who carried on the negotiations with Jephthah in Judges 11. He is, the elders are looking for a military commander, and they interview Jephthah. Clearly, he can't have picked the men he dealt with. They came to him. I'll say more about this passage later on. And the promises they made implied a representative and ongoing role for themselves. Their agreement with Jephthah is subsequently ratified by a larger group. The text reads, "Then Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and captain over them." So we can imagine here an executive committee of elders and a popular assembly of male heads of families called the people. The elders have negotiating powers. The people have the power of ratification. The biblical scholar Baruch Halpern has argued that this is the standard constitutional pattern in ancient Israel. But there are too few examples of this pattern and too many exceptions to it. So the argument is plausible, but I think radically uncertain. In any case, we're given no information as to how the executive committee was chosen or who its members were. So the really important question is why the biblical writers have so little interest in the Constitution. Halperns' pattern isn't visible in what must be the critical case, the acceptance of David as king by the northern tribes. So all the elders of Israel came to the king in Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. The people aren't mentioned here. On the other hand, the elders aren't mentioned in the account of the formal appointment of Solomon as David's successor, which is the work of courtier priests and prophets together with the palace guard. The people appear at the last minute, not to confirm, but merely to acclaim the new king, and they blew the trumpet, and all the people said, "God save King Solomon." Where were the elders? Once the monarchy was established, the role of the elders at the national level seems to have been largely, if not entirely, advisory and ceremonial. But their appearances in the first and second book of Kings are too infrequent to say even that with certainty. It's useful here to compare two narratives of King Ahab's wars with Aram, that is Syria, described in 1 Kings chapters 20 and 22. In chapter 20, Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, demanded a heavy tribute from Israel. And King Ahab called all the elders of the land to advise him on how to respond. And all the elders and all the people said unto him, "Hearken not unto Ben-Hadad, nor consent." Where the people came from is unclear, since only the elders had been called. Perhaps the people were only there by virtue of representation. Their opinion is included in that of the elders, or perhaps the call was a military call-up, and the advice was given by the officers and endorsed by the soldiers. All that the author of Kings wants us to know, however, is that Ahab did not act without consulting some of his subjects. Having done that, he fought a successful war. 3 years later, in chapter 22, Ahab was ready to fight again, this time in alliance with Jehoshaphat of Judah. At Jehoshaphat's request, the two kings sought out the prophets, inquiring of the Lord. And as you'll remember from the last lecture, they got conflicting responses from Ahab's 400 court prophets and from the solitary Micaiah, son of Imlah, and then the kings decided for themselves. Where were the elders? Did elders and prophets compete for the king's attention? How did the king decide whether to seek advice from the representatives of the people, if that's what the elders were, or from the prophets of the Lord? Certainly no constitutional requirements emerge from these two narratives. Were the elders genuine representatives or only witnesses, as in Ruth? Even on ceremonial occasions, it's not apparent that they stood in place of some larger group. Consider the first two verses of 2 Kings 23, which begin the account of Josiah's covenant renewal. "And the king sent, and they gathered unto him all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. And the king went up into the house of the Lord, and all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem with him, and the priests and the prophets, and all the people, both small and great." Why were the elders summoned first? And where were the elders when everyone else went up to the temple? 2 Chronicles gives the same account of Josiah's covenanting, except that the prophets disappear and are replaced by the Levites. What the relation of the elders was to any of these groups remains obscure. When everyone was present, whom did the elders represent? If they had no representative role, why aren't they simply included in the historian's list of people who went up to the temple? It is a popular and attractive idea suggested, for example, by the great Israeli historian Yehezkel Kaufman, that the elders carry forward into the monarchic period the primitive democracy of Israel's early history. They are a democratic constraint on the king's power, just as the priests are an aristocratic constraint. If the priests are more important in palace politics, the elders are more important locally. They are close to the people. They rule in the city gates. And on national occasions, they represent all those men and women who stay home in Israel's villages and small towns. The picture in 2 Kings chapter 6 of the elders of Dothan sitting with Elisha, the plebeian folk prophet, fits reasonably well with this theory. And so does the simplicity and informality conveyed by the story of Ruth. Though Boaz was a wealthy man, and the easiness of his relationship with the elders might well point to something other than democracy. Indeed, the theory of a democratic eldership is, I think, fanciful. We have no historical account of Israel's primitive democracy. The eldership is very old, and elders of make fairly regular appearances in all the biblical writings, beginning, as we've seen, with the account of bondage in Egypt. Moses' effort, following the advice of Jethro, to replace the elders with appointed rulers of thousands and rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s and rulers of 10s, seems to have failed. Later on, the king's mercenaries had rulers of this sort, of this arithmetical sort, but the people as a whole are never again said to be organized in accordance with Jethro's advice. Even the restatement of Exodus of the Jethro story in Deuteronomy makes a subtle but significant concession to elderly and kin group authority. The earlier account in Exodus says, "And Moses chose able men out of all Israel," implying a meritocratic selection. Whereas the Deuteronomist says, this is Moses speaking now, "So I took the chiefs of your tribes, wise men and known," implying the acceptance of traditional authority. Why should we imagine these tribal chiefs as democratic leaders? Perhaps they're called wise merely because they're chiefs. Perhaps they are chiefs merely because their families are rich and powerful. Even then, of course, they might command the respect of ordinary Israelites, and they might well represent the interests not only of their own families, but also of their clans or tribes. It is perhaps a small sign that the elders did play a representative role during the monarchic period, that they hardly ever figure in prophetic denunciations of the powers that be. Kings, priests, prophets, and judges are all condemned. The elders are rarely even mentioned. It may be, again, that the prophets didn't think them important. They didn't share the power of the powers that be. Or Isaiah's one attack on them may tell the whole story. Isaiah says, "The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders of his people and the princes thereof, for ye have eaten up the vineyard, the spoil of the poor is in your houses." Once again, we know so little about the elders that we can construct reality in any way we wish. But primitive democracy is an especially odd construction, given that the texts contain nothing that remotely resembles a doctrinal defense of popular government. Certainly, the idea that the voice of the people is the voice of God is unknown to the biblical writers. In the Bible, the voice of God is the voice of God. He speaks to Moses and the prophets, and through them to the people. The people are consistently pictured as standing, often willfully, at a distance. In accordance with this picture, we might say that the elders most faithfully represent the people when they repudiate God's rule and ask for a king. It is indeed the people as a whole that Samuel later criticizes for this wicked request, though the elders are more forcefully present here than in any of their other textual appearances. We might still, despite all I've just said, we might read many of the references to Israel's elders as if they reflect a modest democratic idea that on secular matters, at least, the people or their representatives should be consulted and perhaps even obeyed. God does, after all, give the people a king against his better judgment. But this should is never explicitly stated, never given doctrinal force. The biblical writers never seem embarrassed, never seem dismayed when they describe political decisions made in the absence of elders and people alike. And these include some of the most consequential decisions of Israel's kings. Hezekiah's rejection of the Assyrian demand for surrender, and Zedekiah's disastrous rebellion against Babylonian rule. In both these cases, prophets are consulted, elders are not. Where were the elders? And the two kings, though one of them follows prophetic advice and the other doesn't, stand alike under the doctrinal demand that God's prophets should be heeded. The advice of the elders, sometimes solicited and sometimes not, carries no such authority. It seems likely that the eldership became newly important in the years of the exile, the Babylonian exile, and after, revived it may be by the collapse of the monarchy. The elders of Israel who sit in Ezekiel's house in Babylon and listen to his prophecies recall the elders who sat with Elisha. No similar alliance is attested for any of the prophets between these two. And it is the elders, again, who are said to have been strengthened by the prophesying of Haggai and Zechariah and enabled to complete the building of the Second Temple. The elders are prominent in the book of Ezra, though they don't appear at all in Nehemiah. It makes sense, some sense, that the disappearance of the king's household would make the other households and their male heads more visible. But the government of the Israelites returning from exile to Jerusalem is hardly democratic. The texts seem to emphasize the autocratic character of Nehemiah's rule. The historian Morton Smith compares him to a Greek tyrant. And the opponents of both Ezra and Nehemiah appear to be lay and priestly oligarchs. This time the elders are there in the texts, but who they were and what powers they exercised are not revealed. So the minds and hearts of the biblical writers were not engaged by the elders. The office and the office holders are treated casually, partly, I'm sure, because readers were expected to have firsthand knowledge about them. But I think there's another reason for this neglect, which has to do with the secular and non-covenantal character of the eldership. It's true, indeed, that 70 elders of Israel participated in some sort of covenantal meal on Mount Sinai, along with Moses and Aaron. A very dramatic moment. They saw God and did eat and drink. That's from Exodus 24. But the elders don't derive their authority from the Sinai revelation. They were already present in Egypt, despite their non-appearance at the meeting with Pharaoh. They are the ones who marked the houses of the Israelites with blood in Exodus 12. They broke bread with Jethro, according to Exodus 18, just before his extraordinary proposal to choose rulers of thousands, and so on, as if the elders weren't standing right there. The eldership is the only one of Israel's offices that has no biblical founding. It's not established by covenant like the monarchy and the priesthood. Its members are not called like the prophets and the judges, nor is there a divine command, as with magistrates, that they be appointed. Whether or not it is a democratic office, it is certainly a primitive office, that is, an early and ancient one. Even in Deuteronomy, where elders are mentioned more often than in any other biblical book and assigned specific tasks in the legal system, their existence is simply assumed. Though they are present at all the covenantings, their activities, when we are told what it is they do, are mostly secular. They negotiate on questions of security with judges like Jephthah. They act as low-level judicial officers in matters of criminal and civil law. They give counsel to kings, contrasted by Ezekiel with the vision of the prophets and the law of the priests, both of which are divine in origin. They ask Samuel for a king to rule them like the other nations. They consult with Ahab about war and peace. They recall a crucial precedent at the trial of Jeremiah, but play no further part in the proceedings. None of this is unimportant, obviously, but it is reported without comment. No effort is made in any of the biblical texts to describe the work of the elders in general terms or to fix their place in the political or legal hierarchy. Even more interesting than this omission, it seems to me, is the non-appearance of the elders in the Messianic visions. They have no place at all, it seems, in the days to come. Your old men shall dream dreams, Joel says, but though he uses the Hebrew word that is usually translated as elders, it's clear that he's referring to all the old men and not to some set of office holders. The sole reference to elders in the visions of the prophets occurs in Isaiah 24, describing a future time when the Lord of hosts shall reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem and before his elders gloriously. But these are God's elders, not Israel's. Isaiah is probably referring to a group that appears occasionally in other prophetic writings, the elders of the priests. Elders certainly have a place in the Messianic Age, and so do prophets, though there are suggestions that both these specialized roles will be abolished, that Israel will be a kingdom of priests. All Israelites will offer sacrifices, and all Israelites will prophesy. Kings have a central place in at least some of the visionary futures. Judges, too, make an occasional appearance, since justice must be done even in Messianic time. In Isaiah 2, God is the judge of the nations. In Ezekiel's visions, the priests double as judges. But where are the elders? Will their specialized tasks, whatever they are, be shared among all the people? We will all grow old, but will we all be elders in the days to come? I suspect that the eldership had no place in Messianic time because it had no specifically religious meaning or function. Anciently established and familiar to the people, it could not be expunged from the historical record. And moreover, the elders may have been useful participants in or witnesses to the covenantings. And perhaps we are told that they were there in order to strengthen our sense that we were also there and are bound by our vicarious presence and agreement. But the eldership had no further or future purpose, and all its secular functions were simply of no interest, beside the point. In a divine politics and a theological history, elders without charisma or calling or divine appointment were entirely superfluous. On any of the biblical accounts of holiness, they derived from a time before Israel became a holy nation. Whatever their actual role in Israel's politics, they are not part of the main story. The main story could, of course, have been told differently, and I suspect sometimes it was told differently. The first book of Maccabees, written only a little too late to be considered for canonization, suggests the possibility it is a secular history. And long passages surviving in the Bible record the secular history of Israel as it must have been understood by some group of Israelite writers and presumably readers. The brilliantly told tale of the Davidic succession is the prime example, and it's worth noting that elders appear several times in the tale, counseling Absalom at the time of his rebellion and negotiating David's return to Jerusalem after the failure of the rebellion. Chronicles, by contrast, reduces the succession narrative to a single line. When David was old and full of days, he made Solomon his son king over Israel. There, that's sacred history without any politics at all, without rebellion, without negotiation, and without the elders. The book of Judges brings the two possible histories, religious and secular, into sharp focus. According to the narrative frame of the book of Judges, God raises up each successive judge-deliverer, like Gideon or Samson or Deborah. Why then does Jephthah have to negotiate the terms of his employment with the elders of Gilead? The Gideon story is closer to our expectations about how divine deliverance should work. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and he sent messengers, and all the people gathered around him. Jephthah, by contrast, is called to a job interview, not with God, but with the tribal elders. The Israelites had already assembled on their own, waiting only for a military commander. The elders functioned as a search committee. Clearly, the Jephthah story was written outside the deliverance framework. It suggests the possibility of a different kind of history in which politics as human contrivance would play a larger part, and so would actors like the elders. Israel might have had a complete rather than a partial and intermittent history of this kind, except that the crucial historians or the last editors who assembled the available materials and discarded whatever didn't suit their purposes were theologically committed. Had a secular political history been written, or had it been fully preserved, we would probably know far more than we do about Israel's constitutional arrangements, the limits on royal authority, the rival power centers, the nature of political conflict, the relation of local and national officials. We would probably know exactly where the elders were and who they were and what they did. Let me say a few words now in conclusion. I want to say something about what we can learn from these biblical accounts of kings and prophets and elders. Mostly, my argument in these 3 lectures has been negative in character. Kingship is an authentically political regime, and the courtly writers who elaborated the high theory of kingship probably meant to describe what the Greeks would later call the best regime. And yet God agreed only reluctantly to the establishment of the monarchy, and in fact, no agreement on the value of kingship is reflected in the biblical texts. Nor, however, is there any real argument about other regimes. The Bible contains an explicit history of political change, from the kingship of God and the rule of charismatic judges, to the establishment of the monarchy, to the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests and the incorporation of Judea into an imperial system, and finally to the rise of the temple priesthood within that system. Each of these regimes had its beneficiaries and its defenders, and biblical texts can be pressed into the service of any and all of them. But there is a sense, I think a deep sense, in which the Bible as a whole is politically disinterested. The question of the best regime isn't a central question. The relation of rulers and subjects matters very little compared to the relation of God and Israel, the ultimate ruler and the favored subject. God's sovereignty diminishes all the possible political arrangements. They exist in his shadow as mere human contrivances. So perhaps this is what we should learn. Despite the high theory of kingship, no political regime should be imagined as religiously necessary or divinely appointed. They are all simply our contrivances, as good or bad as the human beings who make them. And therefore, we should never make too much of them. We should never grant absolute power to any of them, for that belongs to God alone. The prophets are critics of all human rulers, without exception. But they are divinely appointed critics. They are not, or not yet, citizen critics. They speak in God's name and insist that they should be heeded because they speak in God's name, but they never attempt to organize a popular following that might give their message some practical political force. The message itself is rarely the subject of dispute. Only the credentials of the messengers are disputed. The prophets don't call upon ordinary Israelites who don't have the credentials to join them in speaking against injustice. They create, perhaps for the first time, a public space for critical discourse, but their own view is that only they can rightly inhabit that space. It isn't yet a space for democratic discussion. And so the discussions of the elders, who may or may not have been representatives of the people, have no place in the biblical texts. What the elders said or did among themselves is unrecorded, nor is there any account in the texts of representation or deliberation or political decision-making. These are, again, of little interest to the biblical writers. It was in Greece, not in Israel, that these issues were first explicitly addressed. We might say, therefore, that people who look for divine instruction as to the best political arrangements are, in fact, free to choose whatever arrangements they prefer. In The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare writes, quote, that the devil can cite scripture for his purpose, which is true enough. So can royalists and Republicans. So can theocrats and secularists. But we should be skeptical about any citation that is intended to add divine authority to political preference. This indifference to politics, however, does not extend to the content of the political decisions that are made. The law books and the prophetic books have a lot to say about what the leaders of the community, whoever they are, ought to do. Policy is not free. Indeed, the prophets had something like a program, moral rather than political in character, but programmatic in a way that we can recognize as politically important. They call for the enforcement of the covenant and its laws, the release of slaves, the rule about leaving the corners and gleanings of your fields to the poor, the regulation of pledges and wage payments to the benefit of the workers, and the reiterated injunction to care for the weak, Israelite and stranger alike. Here is Jeremiah's version of the program. If ye thoroughly amend your ways and your doings, if ye execute judgment between a man and his neighbor, if ye oppress not the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, and shed not innocent blood, neither walk after other gods to your hurt, then will I cause you to dwell in this place forever and ever. But there's no discussion in the Bible about what ought to be done to make sure that judgment is rightly executed, that strangers, orphans, and widows are not oppressed, and that innocent people are not injured or killed. That is everyday politics, and the biblical writers are not interested. They give us a powerful account of what justice requires, and they tell us that justice must be pursued. Justice, justice shalt thou pursue. But how to do that, who the best political agents are, and what form the pursuit of justice should take, we have to figure that out for ourselves. There is an implicit separation of religion and politics in the Bible, at least in this sense, which is a critical sense, because God does not decree a political order. He leaves politics to us. Thank you.
Well, we can invite your questions now, so please come to one of the microphones. And
in current times, we have something like elders functioning like the clan leaders of American Indian tribes, or like in Afghanistan, that there's different confronting tribes. And in fact, I'm no expert on this, but there's some formalized procedure there of having annual meetings of elders to decide things. Do you think there could be parallels between other pre-state, organizational systems and the role of either elders or tribal leaders or whatnot? Could that cast some light on what the role of the elders in biblical times could have been?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. There is a book, actually, came out not many years ago, called The Elders of Ancient Israel by Hanoch Raviv, and he does exactly that. He looks at comparable societies about which we have a little more information, a lot of it from anthropologists, and tries to figure out what the role of the elders in ancient Israel might be from the role that elders played in other societies about which we have better information. And that is a very useful thing to do if what you're interested in is who the elders really were and what they were doing. But my interest is in what the biblical writers thought about the elders and why they thought so little about them. And there I'm looking for clues as to their larger political vision, which really doesn't include in any significant way, doesn't include these representatives of the people, of the clans and families, if that's what the elders were.
Well, they were the super delegates of their time.
Yes, that's...
On the other side there?
I'm going to go back to who might the writers be, and in thinking about that, I thought about the opening of the Psalms and how they ascribe it to David. And I remember my teacher Beth Huppen saying, "Well, that's a good way to get them published in a sense. Ascribe it to David, even if you're not David." But it suggests to me, when I think of it in sociological terms, that when you think of the other, and we're very good at doing that for groups that are not ours, that it's a distancing kind of mechanism. And so it makes me think that the scribes were perhaps in the employ of the king, and therefore the others are another body that they do not wish to grant suzerainty or power, and therefore they gloss. I just wondered what you might think of that approach.
Well, we don't know all that much about the scribes either. But yes, our guess is that they were courtly, that they were courtiers of some sort or court employees. They worked for the king. And so what is most remarkable about the text that we have is that it includes so many significant expressions of hostility to kingship. There is something in the story of the biblical writers, something that we don't fully understand about their openness to disagreement, their willingness to preserve historical records that in other cultures would have been repressed or rewritten or harmonized in some fashion. And it's true in many areas, including the three law codes, which are often different from one another, and they're all there, and they're not rewritten to make them consistent. It's as if the later tradition. I said this at one of the earlier lectures. It's as if the later tradition of Talmudic argument and of preserving dissenting opinions is already somehow present in the world of the scribes.
If I understood you correctly, you were saying God is, as presented in the biblical writings, is against theocracy and is suspicious of a Jewish theocracy. Where do the modern purveyors of who are pushing like a Torah theocracy come from if don't have a basis in biblical writings?
Yes, well, I don't think I said that God himself is suspicious of theocracy. He's suspicious of kingship. And he describes kingship as the rule of the king as a replacement for his own rule, and he accepts that because the people have asked for a king, they should have a king, and the direct rule of God, well, there is no direct rule, the rule of God through these deliverers raised up to save the people, this regime will be replaced by kingship. Now, it's not called theocracy. It's not your rule that's being challenged, God says, but my rule. It's the rule of the priests that is named theocracy. That's Josephus, the great historian of ancient Israel, whose role in the revolt against Rome is very problematic. It is Josephus who described the rule of the priests during the period of the Second Temple, who described that as a theocracy, because the priests were supposedly they were the carriers of God's law to the people, and I think when the rabbis replaced the priests after the destruction of the temple, they took on that role. They were the interpreters of God's word, and thought of themselves as the authorized interpreters, and it was their learning that gave them authority. And the Talmudic academies were the centers for a kind of political rule. And that's where the current model of a Torah state comes from. It's not a biblical creation. It's an interpretation of rabbinic authority, and it's an effort to reestablish rabbinic authority. And it's not so different from the kind of authority that is claimed in Iran by the Council of Sages. In fact, a Jewish Torah state would be ruled by a council of rabbinic sages, much like contemporary Iran.
But a sage is not an Ayatollah.
Sages, yes, and there wouldn't be, or there probably wouldn't be a chief sage. There'd be a lot of argument among the sages.
If I could encourage you to give us your gut feeling about the question I'm going to ask, because I know the easy way to answer it would be to say, well, there's no evidence one way or the other. But I'm really curious to know what your gut feeling is, which is something that you've mentioned in all three lectures, and you concluded the third one with it, was this whole absence of a discussion of workaday politics as a central theme of the biblical text. I'm wondering if you have a gut feeling as to what extent that absence is part of the shadow of the exile, of the fact that the Jewish state, the first Jewish state, was destroyed and the people were taken away, and how that might have conditioned the biblical writers and the canonizers, how that might have conditioned their attitude toward workaday politics.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question and an important question. Again, great scholars disagree about how much of the Bible was actually written or edited in exile in Babylon. Certainly, much of the texts, the royal histories were probably written, though perhaps not finally edited, before the exile. And you may be right. We know what happened after the exile, that politics was systematically devalued by Jewish writers. There's that line, that famous maxim from Pirkei Avot, which sums it all up. Love work, hate lordship, and seek no intimacy with the ruling powers. That was the politics of exile, except that we had to have the court Jew who had to be intimate with the ruling powers to protect the rest of us. So there was, the politics of exile was the politics of Stadlanut, of the court Jew, a politics that the Zionists hated and quite rightly wanted to bring to an end. But that's exile. Now, in the years from Joshua to the Babylonian destruction of the first temple, which is 500 years or more, we had a state. And presumably we were very interested in it. And I'm sure there was, as I said, there was a secular history in addition to the theological history. And some of it is written down. The story of David and Solomon and of Absalom's revolt and of the succession crisis and is brilliantly told, and it is a purely secular story. There's no divine intervention at all. It's a story of palace politics. And as a portrait of what monarchies are really like, it's one of the very best. But somehow the final writers, that's not where they were interested. Now maybe the final writers were already in exile or after the destruction of the state. That would cast a very strong light on what I've been saying. But as I said, great scholars don't agree on when the final editing took place.
Well, thank you, Professor Walzer, and thank everyone for coming.